From the middle of the 1940s until a ceasefire in 2016, Colombia was in a constant state of turmoil. From crime lords and drug trafficking to paramilitary groups and terrorism, the country was constantly under threat of war and conflict. 45% of the population of Colombia still live below the poverty line today. And then hidden in plain sight, like a mouthed secret, is the overwhelmingly large population of homeless, desperately poor, forgotten children that inhabit the streets of Colombia. 1 out of 10 kids in Colombia never receive any education. Many of these kids are homeless and live in the sewers underneath the capital city of Bogota. They're so used to roaming around in waist-deep trenches of shit, pitch-black darkness, odor, and scurrying rats that they truly feel like they're at home. They feel safe down there in the shadows, and most of the lost children wouldn't leave if you asked them to. Kids as young as 10 years old often turn to prostitution for money, but even that earns them nothing more than a few pesos. Foreign tourists contribute a lot to this horrible trade, exploiting children and reaping sick advantages over Colombian families that live in abject poverty. Humanium.org states, Colombian children who are victims of sex trade are subjected to all its degrading perversions, including child pornography, sexual abuse, sadistic violence, etc. The country's legal system is weak in this regard and lacks credibility in both prevention and prosecution. However, recent trials and other measures give hope that sterner and more strenuous action will be taken in enforcing the law and punishing offenders in the future. Paul Martin from UNICEF states, the biggest challenge that Colombia faces is that of violence. Domestic violence, violence at school, street violence. It is a country completely traumatized by violence. Over 10,000 child soldiers have been known to take part in Colombian armed conflicts by way of either being informants or directly participating in combat. Many of these innocent children end up injured, disabled, or dead, and around 10% of births in the country are never even registered. Then 20% of rural children fail to ever even appear on administrative records. Weak to no education, sexual exploitation, child marriage, child labor, drug use, poverty, violence, and homelessness are all wide paths to overlooking the voices of these kids. And when we overlook or outright refuse to hear the cries of the innocent, we show them the door to hell. He is hell. On January 25th, 1957, in the quaint village of Genova Quindeo, Manuel Antonio Garavito and Rosa Delia Cubellos welcomed the birth of their first child, Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubellos. This newborn son would be the couple's first of 7 children. Later on, he would have 3 brothers and 3 sisters. Luis Garavito describes his father as an alcoholic womanizer who abused him physically and emotionally in extreme ways throughout his childhood. He also claims his mother was a violent person who showed very little affection towards him as a child. Garavito's parents' marriage plagued his home life with years of fighting, violence, and heavy bouts of neglect. Around the age of 7, Luis claims Manuel strapped him to a chair and beat him with a tree branch for trying to defend his mother. Apparently, Manuel Garavito was so ruthless that he even beat Rosa during her pregnancies. It was a harsh upbringing for sure, and Luis never knew when to expect his own beatings from Manuel. He said they were so severe and unpredictable that he and his siblings used to run and hide when his dad would return home from work. To Garavito's claims, he grew up with Manuel frequently calling him names like imbecile, bastard, and son of a bitch. Luis said his father never had a good word on him. He further stated that he recalled his father once fondling him when they slept in bed together. He remembered the incident vaguely. Due to the ongoing armed conflict at the time, Garavito and his family were forced to move to a new town. That's where Luis attended Simón Bolívar School. There he was found to be shy and reserved, often a target for bullies who harassed him. They used to call him Squiggle due to his use of glasses. And no one played with Luis. Teachers found him keen to learn, but commented about his frustration with his inability to understand certain lessons. But Luis claims these teachers never made any attempts to stop his bullies, and this left him in a constant state of distress during school. Luis was taken out of school by his father in the 5th grade and forced to work to help bring in money for the family. The young man was also forbidden to have friends or girlfriends. Then between the ages of 12 and 14, Luis Garavito suffered brutal sexual molestation via a neighborhood friend of his father's. The man, a local drugstore owner, would torture Luis extensively, burning him with candles, violently biting him, and even cutting him with razors during the bouts of abuse. Luis, thinking his father wouldn't believe him or even care what was happening if he told him, declined to report his abuser. And the trauma Garavito endured at the hands of his father's friend apparently left him unable to ejaculate normally or sustain an erection. These problems persisted into adulthood. Shortly after this horrific abuse began, Luis killed 2 birds with stones and dissected them. He claims he immediately felt shameful remorse following his actions, and who knows if he really did, but around the same time, he started trying to coerce his younger brothers and sisters to sleep naked with him. If they refused, he'd simply pull their clothes off when they were asleep, and that's when Luis Garavito began fondling his siblings. Manuel and Rosa either didn't know or just didn't give a shit. Luis had reportedly become significantly withdrawn and extremely aggressive. In his own words, he was ready to extract revenge on this world. So as a pre- or early teen, Garavito also began abusing a 6-year-old boy. When Luis turned 14, he claims to have been raped by another neighbor that beat him in the process. Supposedly, this was another one of Manuel's friends. The same person also showed him heterosexual pornography. Garavito claims it didn't arouse him. As a matter of fact, he said it disgusted him. When he turned 15, he tried to establish sexual relationships with women, but found himself constantly rejected by them. On Garavito's mother's side, he had 2 uncles that were alcoholics, and his maternal grandfather even died because of the cirrhosis he garnered due to alcoholism. Luis Garavito was already genetically predisposed to the disease, and due to the fact that alcohol was easy to obtain, it didn't take long for addiction to grab hold of the young man. Throughout his teenage life, Luis was kicked out of his home multiple times. He was rebellious, violent, and sexually aggressive. When his mother once caught him trying to rape a 6-year-old boy, she threw him out herself. He came back, and Rosa let her deeply troubled teenage son back in. When Luis was 16, he was put out again following the attempted assault of a 6-year-old boy at a train station in Bogotá. The boy screamed before Garavito could act out his evil intentions. This alerted nearby authorities, who quickly arrested him. But Luis Garavito had an excuse. He said he only wanted to lightly abuse the boy, so reportedly with a slap on the wrist, they let him go, and he ended up back at home with his family in no time. But Manuel wasn't happy. As a matter of fact, he was pissed. Not because of what his son had done, but because he felt Luis should have chosen a woman to assault instead. And from there, Manuel and the teenager fought constantly about Garavito's homosexuality. This led to Luis being thrown out of his family home for the final time at the age of 16. He was friendless, loveless, and unstable, but for the first time in his life, he was completely free to do whatever he wanted. The antisocial monster was now off the leash. For a while, in his late teens, Garavito seemed to have found his path. He had a job as an assistant at a compensation fund and later on ended up working in a chain of stores. He even managed to study marketing during this time. It seemed like maybe getting shot of Rosa and Manuel's violent atmosphere was exactly what the young man needed. But the reform was short-lived as Garavito began to have problems with his co-workers, clients, and even bosses. These altercations sometimes even graduated to physical levels. So when Luis lost his job, he ended up working as a street vendor selling religious items in markets and even became a migrant worker for a while. During this time, he developed some relationships with women, but most of them remained at a friend zone level. Either he wasn't good at establishing sexual relations with the female sex, or that simply wasn't what he was interested in. In the early 1970s, still teenage Garavito worked on a coffee plantation. Around this time, he fell in love with an older woman named Mari Ocampo Orozco. He lived with Mary on and off throughout his adult life. She was a school teacher and single mother that he went to church with. Luis claimed he had a kid with Mary, only to later state that he never even had intercourse with her. To this day, no one seems to know the truth. Oddly enough, while many women Garavito befriended had children, Luis was known to treat them as his own. He was also a pretty loving boyfriend when he wasn't drinking. Even most of his friends at the time recall him as easy to get along with in spite of his violent temper and bouts of crippling drunkenness. But when he got hammered, the truth came out, and he often vowed to end his father's life. As an adult, Luis suffered from illnesses such as psychosis, paranoia, and dark depression, conditions possibly brought on by the alleged abuse he claims to have suffered as a child. And for most of the 1970s and 80s, Luis would molest both young boys and girls. As his mental state spiraled out of control, his sexual attraction evolved into pederast, meaning pubescent and adolescent boys were prime targets on Garavito's menu. He would insist on being drunk while having sex with female partners, but even then he failed to maintain an erection. As alcoholism devoured Luis Garavito, it wasn't helping him deal with his childhood trauma. So in 1978, he actually started going to AA meetings. In another bid to get his life on track, he converted to the Pentecostal faith and started a new job as a store clerk before reconnecting with his first love, Mary Orozco. She was kind of all he had for a while, and Luis wasn't really close to anyone in his family other than his sister Esther. But even she avoided him due to his alcohol consumption. I imagine he resembled their father when he drank. When Luis moved to Armenia, he got a job at a bakery. Reportedly, some of his crimes were happening on his 2-hour lunch break while working there. Later, he got fired from the bakery for instigating a fight with his coworkers. Then, after attempting to commit suicide, Garavito actually entered psychiatric care in 1979. He expressed his dark desire to die and ended up being treated for depression before being put on medication for psychosis. But Luis never mentioned to the doctors that he was attracted to young boys. He never even told them about his impotence with female companions. It seemed like there was a Jekyll and Hyde aspect to Luis Garavito. At church, he was known to beat himself in the chest as he prayed, seemingly remorseful for his actions. He would also continue to attend AA meetings during this time and even see a therapist, but almost every day ended with Luis Garavito visiting Valencia Park. He went there for one reason and one reason only. It was a hot spot for child prostitution, and he was a regular. In 1980, he met a woman named Claudia, a beautician that Garavito claimed was the first woman's company that he genuinely enjoyed. But the relationship didn't last long, as Luis couldn't keep up with her need to spend money so frequently, and she unwittingly couldn't keep up with his sexual desires either. So instead, Garavito quenched his evil thirst by raping little boys in Quimbaya. Less than a year later, his habit of molesting and raping children wasn't enough to suffice his sexual appetite anymore, so he started torturing them too. And he did that using the same methods that were used on him. Ropes, candles, and razors were among his tools. After his actions, Garavito would write the child's name in a blue notebook and pray for them while beating his chest black and blue. Despite his attempt at holiness, Luis also expressed an interest in esoteric studies, tarot readings, and even Satanism. He even went to palm readers and occult practitioners before coming to the conclusion that, well, they knew about as much as he did when it came to spirituality. Another demon Luis took a liking to was Adolf Hitler. He found his biography fascinating and ended up damn near falling for the guy. He admired the mass graves, but Luis was really fond of World War II concentration camps. Alongside his idolization of Hitler, in 1986, Garavito became obsessed with another Colombian mass murderer named Campo Elias Delgado. Delgado was a Vietnam veteran who mass murdered 28 people, including his own mother, a horrible feat that Luis Garavito wished to emulate. Luis developed fantasies very few of us can relate to. He admired mass murderers and, at one point, even took a shine to the tragedies happening in American high schools. Angry, sadistic, and deeply disturbed, Garavito wanted to get himself a machine gun and, starting with his own father, Manuel, assassinate his whole family before turning the gun on himself. He felt that this was the perfect way for him to go out swinging. After Luis was seen drunk in the company of minors, namely leaving a bar with them, it quickly became evident to Garavito's friends that he was attracted to young boys. But these friends never openly admitted their suspicions, and most of the people around Luis Garavito, including his girlfriends, suspected nothing out of the ordinary in terms of his sexual deviation, like everyone was just distracted by their environment. And so the beast stalked in plain sight, with no one to cry wolf, or at least listen to those who did. In the late 80s, Luis met another single mother named Graciela Zabaleta. He lived with and provided for her, even going as far as to claim he loved her. But Graciela had no clue about the darkness residing inside of him, and by all accounts, he never laid a finger on her children or any of his girlfriend's children. On the contrary, he was actually known to be very good with kids and very giving to them. His resemblance to a Disney character earned him the name Goofy, or in Spanish, Tribilín. While playing with a Ouija board, Luis Garavito claims to have entered a state of psychosis. During this trance, he said the devil spoke to him and beckoned for his service. Garavito agreed, claiming Satan responded saying, "Kill, that with killing, many things may come." On October 1st of 1992, Luis targeted a young boy that was selling cigars and candy to passerbys. In a drunken state, he lured the child away from the Melia Hotel sector in Bolivar, Colombia. He planned to abduct the boy and take him to a wooded lot, but local police interrupted the affair and arrested Luis. At the police station, they beat Garavito over the head with a pistol and then robbed him of his watch, his money, and a ring before letting him go free. It just shows that corruption wasn't limited to the inside of Luis Garavito, but rather, it completely polluted his atmosphere from the top down. It must be said that Garavito was at least somewhat a product of his cold environment. On October 4th of 1992, Just a few days after his failed attempt at murder, Garavito would finally kill someone. He spotted a 13-year-old named Juan Carlos near a bazaar. Luis claims the reflection of the moonlight caused a strange force to resonate inside him, invoking a drunken rage as he recalled his childhood trauma. So he bought a rope and a butcher's knife as he proceeded to stalk the young man. The beast was waiting for the perfect moment. And when the time was right, he approached Juan Carlos and offered him between 500 and 1,000 pesos for work. The boy obliged, accepting the offer before following Luis Garavito away from Yamonde to a secluded area near a local train track. It was here that Garavito's first murder victim met a horrible fate. The body of 13-year-old Juan Carlos was found with his front teeth knocked out and severe cuts to his rectum and throat. His genitals had also been severed. 6 days later, while visiting his sister in Tulua, Luis murdered 12-year-old Jan Alexander Penaranda in similar fashion. From this point on, Luis Garavito began to ruthlessly torture, rape, and murder young boys as frequently as he could. All of his victims shared similar ages and socioeconomic backgrounds. They were mostly between the ages of 6 and 13 with the exception of one handicapped 16-year-old boy, and they all were suffering from extreme poverty. They were desperate for food, money, work, whatever. Whatever they wanted, Luis was an expert at convincing them he had it, and he used their desperation to his advantage. Most of the victims were homeless or orphaned anyway, meaning a lower chance of people noticing they were missing, and voices were silenced through screams. Luis Garavito felt a force to kill. He felt compelled to lure these innocent young boys away, but he did so by daylight. Apparently, Garavito was terrified of the dark. He would sometimes even wait near schools drinking brandy as he searched for unsuspecting poor children he could target and stalk. Luis had a preference. He was looking for boys with light-colored eyes, fair complexion, and soft skin, and he knew where to find children that fit his descriptive desires. During this time, Luis began wearing a multitude of different disguises in order to evade law enforcement. To avoid detection, he even traveled out of the country where he continued to select victims at will. To further gain the trust of children, Luis pretended to be a school teacher, farmer, charity worker, restaurant manager, drug dealer, monk, and often a priest. And while he would alternate his disguise frequently, he always wore the same red-trimmed glasses. Once he had the trust of these children, he would then lead them to a spot far away where no one would interrupt his plans. He would wear the kid out by talking to him about his personal life, and often the travel alone would be so long that the boys would be too tired to resist, let alone run away from Luis when he pounced. And these kill spots Garavito lured the children to were carefully selected beforehand. It was common for Garavito to have slain his victims there before. Sometimes new victims would even stumble upon the remains of previous ones, but by that time, it was too late to escape the beast. The kids were tired and vulnerable, and he was in control. After heavy alcohol consumption, Garavito would tie the boys up with the rope and bound them. Then he'd terrorize them with a knife before molesting them and often masturbate on them. But that wasn't the height of it by any means. Luis claims he made a pact with the devil, and children were the blood sacrifices he offered. It's not easy to hear, but you have to understand that these kids were subject to prolonged bouts of rape and torture in ways you've probably never heard before. They were bitten, beaten, and stomped on. Their teeth were frequently knocked out. Many of the bodies were found with over 100 stab wounds and deep cuts on their backs. And from there it just gets worse. While alive, the child's buttocks and feet were stabbed with a screwdriver. Garavito would also use broken blades or used razors to make incisions and cut off slices of the victims' rear ends. It wasn't uncommon for the children to be burned with lighters or candles either. He also forced sharpened items into their rectums. Sometimes the victim was even impaled with an object through the anus and out of the mouth. I told you this was going to get bad, and I said I wouldn't give you another warning, but I'm breaking that promise and I'm warning you. Don't continue listening if this is going to traumatize you, but it is the truth. Often while still alive, the victim's genitals were removed and placed in the mouth of the child. Garavito would also disembowel the child during rape or decapitate him. Luis claims this is the way he would reach climax. It's also thought that necrophilia was involved in some of the murders. All of the victims were found naked with extreme signs of prolonged torture and abuse. Containers of lubricant and empty bottles of the cheapest brandy money can buy were often found near the mass graves where most of Garavito's killings were done. And while the majority of Luis Garavito's victims were boys, he murdered a few female children and some adults too. But the adults were killed to eliminate witnesses as opposed to reasons of sexual gratification. It's also worth noting that oftentimes, Garavito kept more than one boy bound at a time, while he violated another one in front of a terrified audience. This shows the absolute height of his cruelty and need to dominate while mentally torturing his prey. Very few of the specific victims' details are known, even though Luis Garavito kept a diary of his crimes. But there are 4 known surviving victims. In 1979, Luis abducted 9-year-old William Mora, who was about to go play with his friends. Garavito grabbed him and threatened to murder him if he screamed, so the young man said nothing. Luis led him to an abandoned house where he molested and tortured him for 12 hours. But luckily, William escaped when Luis passed out from drinking. In 1988, Garavito assaulted an unidentified boy near a restaurant. Roughly 10 years later, bodies were found on the spot following an earthquake on January 25th of 1999. Coincidentally, Luis Garavito's birthday. The owner of the business, which was destroyed, pointed authorities to Luis Garavito, whom he knew and avoided due to his aggressive drinking tendencies. In the early 1990s, Garavito approached 10-year-old Carlos Alberta and offered him 200 pesos in exchange for work. The boy agreed, and Luis led him to a secluded spot. He held a knife to the kid's throat and proceeded to rape and torture the poor guy. After Garavito asked if the kid enjoyed it, fearful, and rightfully so, 10-year-old Carlos said he did. Garavito replied, "See you next week. That's how I like it, and that's how you like it." And the final known survivor of Luis Garavito was a 16-year-old boy named Brand Alvarez, whose father owned a cockfighting business. As Brand attended to the roosters, Garavito abducted him with a knife to his throat and took him to a vacant spot where he tied him up, beat him, and tortured him by stabbing him with a screwdriver during rape. Luckily, Brand broke free from his restraints and fled from Garavito, just narrowly avoiding a terrible fate. It's now estimated that Luis Garavito abused, raped, tortured, mutilated, and brutally murdered at least 300 boys. There are even some estimates that mark the tally much higher, in the realm of 400, but ultimately, who knows? Maybe Garavito lost count himself. So how did he get away with it for so long? Was he just too clever for the well-trained cops of Colombia? No, not really. Garavito, while street smart and cunning, was completely uneducated. But he took advantage of 2 things we talked about at the first part of this story: corruption and poverty. Starting in October of 1992, boys between the age of 6 and 13 began rapidly disappearing off the streets of Colombia without a trace, due to endless war, violence, and terrorism in the country. Many of these kids had no one to miss them if they disappeared, and for years, these murders went unnoticed. There weren't even any police reports filed for most of these missing children, and even as clusters of dead bodies began popping up all around Colombia, authorities didn't take much notice until around 1997. That's when they discovered mass graves. One held the bodies of as many as 41 children, and some of those remains still haven't been identified. Due to the sheer brutality of the crimes, police initially thought it was the work of some satanic cult or even a child trafficking ring, but they could never have imagined that it was all at the hands of one man that they would later dub the Beast. On February 6th of 1999, near the town of Palmyra, the naked bodies of two lifeless children were discovered lying beside each other in a sugarcane field. The next day, mere yards away, they discovered another body. All three victims suffered the same fate: rape, abuse, and torture. The murder weapon was found nearby. Garavito had actually passed out half naked on top of one of the boys while drunk, with a lit cigarette in his hand. He caught the whole cane field on fire, even burned himself quite severely in the process. In a hurry to get away from the crime scene, Luis left behind shoes, money, underwear, damaged eyeglasses, and a note containing Garavito's girlfriend's address. The red-trimmed glasses alone told authorities that the serial killer was a middle-aged man who had astigmatism in his left eye. The shoes told them that the man they were looking for also walked with a limp and stood roughly 5.5 feet tall. These revelations led cops to arrest 44-year-old local sex offender Pedro Pablo Ramirez Garcia, who also walked with a limp. And I know what you're thinking, but no. He's not the same person as Pedro Alonso Lopez. But the cops knew suspect was kept in jail and they swore they had their man, right up until more kids started disappearing in Bogota. It was around that time that Aldemar Duran, the head detective on the case, started to suspect the involvement of Luis Garavito. And as soon as Detective Duran was able to track down Luis Garavito's sister and girlfriend, they released Pedro Garcia. He might have been a filthy sex offender, but he was no La Bestia. The hunt was on. During his active criminal years, Garavito began to document his crimes in various ways. He began to keep ticket stubs, receipts, clothing, and even cut out the picture in the little boy's ID cards. He'd then store these items in a black suitcase which he kept in the care of either his sister Esther or his on-off girlfriend Mary. I also read that he collected the amputated toes of some of his victims but disposed of them in fear that it would make it easier for police scent dogs to track him down. Neither Esther nor Mary had any clue what Luis was doing in his spare time. In June of 1996, Garavito lost his job selling air fresheners and asked Mary for a place to stay, but she'd grown concerned and a little fearful of his temper and alcohol consumption. Nevertheless, she settled against her gut and took Garavito in temporarily before kicking him out once again. A few months later, in August of 1996, Luis fell in the capital city of Bogota and broke his leg. He stayed with an unknown man for a brief time, but when that didn't work out, he once again begged Mary to let him stay with her. Reluctant, she complied. During this time, Luis Garavito, bound to crutches, armored in a cast, and confined to a neck brace, resorted to begging on the streets of Bogota for the 2 months that he lived with Mary. He helped out with household bills like food and even provided luxuries like a television, but Luis was just too aggressive for cohabitation. He complained that Mary's 15-year-old son was rude and disrespectful, and after he and the teen had a fight about whether or not to watch the local news, Mary sided with her son and evicted Garavito for the final time. As he left in a rage, he damaged a gold chain she'd given him as a gift. A couple months later, on Christmas Day, Mary herself was given a gift from a friend that was visiting her. Garavito must have been watching because he called her in a belligerent fit of jealousy. She explained to him that he was no longer welcome. But the next morning, he showed up anyway, roaring and shouting as he grabbed her by the throat and threatened her. Mary was so terrified of his wrath that her and her family fled to a neighbor's house while Garavito inflicted damage to hers. Hours later, he left a note apologizing and begging Mary for forgiveness. It's thought that she declined the gesture. After that, Luis Garavito was often seen drifting from town to town, staggering around hammered and lit up like a Christmas tree. He quickly wore out his welcome wherever he went due to constant conflicts with just about everyone he came into prolonged contact with. He'd fight with coworkers, abuse his girlfriends, and just generally misbehave. This prevented Luis from developing any meaningful adult relationships, even though he lived with multiple women, including 2 different ones at the time of his eventual arrest. At the end of his crime spree, Luis was seen as nothing more than a homeless drifter roaming around West Colombia. During this time, he went through bouts of depression and claims to have had terrible nightmares about what he did to the children. He said he would wake up crying, but his tears were followed by uncontrollable fits of laughter as he recalled the pleasure he experienced during his heinous acts of evil. In the summer of 1998, Garavito went to Ecuador where he murdered 14-year-old Abel Gustavo Velez on the 20th of July. Next, he killed 12-year-old Jimmy Leonardo Anchondia. He was then spotted near an all-girls school in Santo Domingo, Ecuador, before fleeing and narrowly escaping Ecuadorian police who were closing in on him. But fear of law enforcement didn't stop him from evil, and a short while later, they found the bodies of 2 little girls that had been tortured, raped, and murdered. While the girls weren't Garavito's normal MO, I think authorities actually even suspected Pedro Lopez at this time, but the brutality of the murders didn't add up. They were looking for a more sadistic monster. Detective Duran eventually contacted Garavito's girlfriend by way of the note that Luis had left behind at the burning cane fields. But she told them that she hadn't seen him in months. Then she gave them a black cloth suitcase that Garavito left with her, which contained a number of important things. The items included the cutout ID card photos of the boys, Garavito's journals of his murders, and even tally marks of his victims. This obviously secured the belief that Luis was the beast they'd been tracking. Bills were found in the suitcase, which led law enforcement to Garavito's property, but no one was there. At one point, Garavito got fed up killing young boys because he thought there was no challenge in it. It was then that Luis began to formulate a plan to kidnap several adults and kill them as a part of a giant mass murder scheme. But before he could follow through on his desired design, and a few days after authorities came to his empty property, Luis Garavito would be detained for the attempted assault of 12-year-old John Ivan Sabagal on the 22nd of April, 1999. A 16-year-old heard Garavito trying to subdue the 12-year-old and bravely started chucking rocks at Luis. This just pissed him off, but it was enough for the 2 lucky boys to flee to a farmhouse called Rosa Blanca. But the beast tracked them down. The police were called, and when they arrived, they searched the area. And guess who they found lurking in the woods, waiting? A man claiming to be a local politician. But even with a fake ID, cops weren't buying it. They knew damn well he was Luis Garavito. After cops learned that Garavito was indeed for sure the man they had in custody, for a while, he continued to profess his innocence, but that didn't last long. And when they read out the details of his crimes, he broke down sobbing in tears. It was pitiful.
¿Por qué? ¿Por qué? No, no, no quiero más.
But for Colombian authorities, a confession wouldn't be enough to satisfy them. They wanted to nail him to the cross. Garavito had an eye condition normally found in men of a particular age group. His glasses had been designed specifically for that condition, so the police booked the whole prison for an eye exam, and Garavito's test came back just as they expected. Not only that, but he matched the height of the man they were looking for and even walked with a limp. Then the final pieces of the puzzle were connected when detectives took DNA from Garavito's pillow in his cell and linked it to the DNA left behind on the bodies of his victims. The beast was now in his cage where he couldn't turn on anyone else. Garavito initially confessed to killing around 140 children, but he was charged with murdering 172. Of those, he's been convicted of 138. The rest are ongoing. Luis Garavito was given the longest sentence in Colombian history, 1,853 years and 9 days. But as we know from the Pedro Lopez case, from the very start, this was highly unlikely to stick. There's no life imprisonment or death penalty in Colombia. As a matter of fact, the law there restricts imprisonment of anyone to a maximum of 40 years, no matter what you did or how many times you did it. Later, this was increased to 60 years. And get this, because Luis helped authorities find the victims' bodies, the bodies he piled up, his prison term was reduced to just 22 years, which is very Jesus of them. He'll be eligible for parole in 2023. I'm not shitting you. There's a very real chance that he's gonna get out next year. But hey, he wants to be a politician and enter Congress, as well as become a Pentecostal pastor and marry a woman. Then to top it all off, he wants to help abused kids. Let that sit with you for a second. Luckily, the beast has eye cancer and reportedly receives blood transfusions daily, but that doesn't mean he's harmless. He spends his time alone away from other prisoners for his own safety, and spends his days making earrings, necklaces, and even handcuffs while waiting for his chance to be free. I wish for his freedom only in death. You all know exactly how I feel about evil. I wanted to consult an expert about Luis Garavito, someone who perhaps could give me a little insight into how someone could become so cruel and unimaginably monstrous. So, I started searching, and I found someone. Not only did this person work the Luis Garavito case, but they specifically sat across from him and interviewed him over the course of 3 days, so I reached out expecting nothing more than an echo in return. But I couldn't believe it when this person paused their vacation and agreed to let me interview them about their time they spent studying Luis Garavito. And while I hate that fucking guy with all my heart, it's all about education, right? Then let's learn something. Starting right now. Dr. Mark Benecke is a German forensic biologist whose cases have been covered by National Geographic and the History Channel. He's the author of several best-selling science books on topics like the biology of aging, as well as criminal and forensic biology. Dr. Benecke has also authored a multitude of publications and is a regular guest speaker at universities around the world. He spent 2 years working in the chief medical examiner's office in Manhattan, New York, and he works internationally on forensic cases as a freelance expert witness. But that's not all. To top it off, he also happens to be one of the scientists that worked on the identification of Adolf and Eva Hitler's skull and teeth. He truly has too many accolades to list here, but you can find a link to Dr. Benecke's YouTube channel and various other social media outlets below. But what draws me to Dr. Benecke today is the fact that he's the only forensic scientist to ever work on the case of serial killer Luis Garavito. In fact, on multiple occasions, Mark has met and interviewed Luis in person. Dr. Mark Benecke, it's a pleasure to speak with you. I'm really kind of surprised still that you gave me an interview. It's an honor.
No problem. I mean, you were straightforward, so I'm happy. I'm sitting in New York City right now, so I was not sure if we could match our time zones, but it did work out perfectly. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you again, joining me today for a discussion and deeper glimpse into arguably one of the worst and most prolific serial killers of our time. Now, I want to be straightforward with you. I do want to understand key elements about Luis Garavito from your professional perspective. But make no mistake, my thirst for knowledge and respect for your work does not equal sympathy for the evil acts that have been executed by the beast that lives inside Luis Garavito, and I'm sure you probably share that as well. My subscribers understand where I stand in terms of monsters of humanity. And with that said, welcome to The Disturbing Truth. I'm super excited to hear what you've got to say. It truly is an honor.
Pleasure's on my side.
Okay, let's kick this off. My first question is, how in the world did you find yourself working on the Garavito case, the Luis Garavito case? I mean, what brought you to Colombia in the first place?
I set up laboratories all over the world. For example, I set up the first forensic DNA lab in the Philippines and in Vietnam. And in Colombia, I think I was there to set up a forensic entomology lab, so flies and other insects on corpses. And when I was there, I read in the newspaper that there was a guy who had killed 72 kids, and people were like, no, that's of no relevance, and maybe stay home today, there's nothing to see here, and so on. And that was in Bogota, the capital city of Colombia. And I found that interesting, mostly because I thought, why do my colleagues try to push this thing away? It was just too much of a monstrosity for them, especially since it related to kids.
Sure.
And so when I went back to Germany, I asked a friend of mine who speaks Spanish fluently, and also it's difficult to understand rural Colombian Spanish, which is just a very, very strong accent. And then we talked to the DA, which is the prosecution, and the prosecution said yes, and the local police also said yes, and Garavito also said yes. So and the local priest, because in the meantime he got baptized, the serial killer, the priest also said yes. And so, we just said, okay, let's just talk to each other and see what comes out. It was a very relaxed atmosphere without any particular goals or the police just wanted to know, why did he do it? The DA, the prosecution, was very traumatized, very, very traumatized from the case. The social worker was just like, what the hell is going on? But she also, being a social worker, was very friendly and on cooperative terms. The serial killer himself, Garavito, is a very friendly man, and he was not of course, but he was also very much interested in what I was interested in, because he has very poor education, but he's intelligent enough so that he could have gotten some education. So it was also interesting for him. And that's how it started.
Wow. That's just that's crazy. And obviously Bogota is another place that housed criminal Pedro Alonso Lopez, which is someone I covered in a recent video as well, which is they share similarities. They surely do.
Lopez. Garavito was not in Bogota. I was just in Bogota at the Institute of Legal Medicine, and then I went to wherever it was, Via Vicencio and so on. He was moved to different prisons, but he was not in Bogota. No, the Lopez thing was a big problem. It's good that you already covered it, because in the beginning, people did not realize that he was a homosexual serial killer, because everybody thought that probably there are two killers. They didn't know, but Lopez, they thought he's heterosexual, so he's killing girls, and the one who's killing boys, that's very strange. A female serial killer doesn't make sense. So probably it's also Lopez, but then he would have had to be homosexual, which was not accounted for.
Sure.
So the mix up with Lopez was a problem at the beginning. Yeah.
I would say so, yeah, and I mean, obviously the direct outcome and what could happen in the future with the Garavito case, there's just so many similarities. But we'll take it a step at a time. Dr. Benecki, you not only worked on Garavito's case, but you spent time with him in prison. How much time would you say you spent in total in front of Garavito?
A few days, but obviously prison days. So, for example, in the first prison, they set up a cage, really like in a movie. It was a freestanding cage, and there was just 2 chairs, a table, and a typewriter for for some reason.
Wow.
which you would probably not put into a cage where you have a violent offender, because he could take the typewriter and smash it
Sure.
into the researcher's head or something. But well, anyway, these were different times and different circumstances. And then later, when he was moved to a different prison, it was inside, and there was coffee that he arranged to organize, and paper, batteries, pens, everything. So it depended on the situation, but it was a few days. It's very odd. In the first prison, there was a rule that women must cover their legs and their feet. And there was even a sign at the entrance, and I was like, "What is this about?" Just as soon as the prisoners see just a little bit of female naked skin, so to speak, even if it's just a foot, then everything gets out of control. So
Sure.
it's the female day or the women's day, and also regulation to cover your feet and your legs and so on. These are things that you are not used to in other prison situations, but it's wild. Also, the types of crime over there are much, much harder compared to, let's say, Central or Northern Europe. I mean, normally you don't see these types of violent crimes in such abundance compared to what you see in Colombia, obviously.
And a lot of that's fueled by the political unrest that's been there for over half a century. It's pretty crazy to see what's going on. I mean, this is where I think a lot of these predators would find space to get these kids, because there's just so much else going on that's violent, between paramilitary, political unrest. It just seems so...
corruption also. One problem was also that abductions were normal. For example, one of my students got abducted, but whilst observing birds, and we all felt guilty, because we were like, okay, why did the university let him go, and so on, a biology student. And then the father of the student was like, hey, calm down, don't worry, I will negotiate that. So abductions were very normal. So it was not only that there was a lot of violent crime going on, where people died on a regular basis, paramilitares and all the narcotic stuff and so on, and guerrilla, and before that the la violencia, the time of the violence, but that was before. But also abductions were just normal business. And the next problem was that the kids was all socio-economically weak kids. So when the mothers, and I know that firsthand, when the mothers went to the police, then the police was like, hey, sorry, I mean, you are working in a bar. The father is unknown. The kid is not going to school because it, disappeared during daylight, but it was seen on the marketplace. Sorry, your kid just ran away.
Wow.
Go away. So nobody believed that. So there was a number of factors that made it worse. Also, the police was completely out of their league. Sometimes they asked me, do you think that the music that people listen to in that area makes people violent or something like that? And I'm like,
wow.
No, it's not the music.
Wow. So they were that untrained to handle something like that. I mean, that's from the top up, or the top down, I should say. Wow, I didn't realize it was like that.
Also, and one thing was there had been an earthquake, so much of the identification features when all the corpses were found, then they were just unknown, because especially the teeth. Sometimes you have X-rays from teeth or something, but since there had been an earthquake in Armenia before, everything was lost, even all medical records. So when the decomposed corpses were found, it was close to impossible to identify them, especially since the the statements of the mothers were never recorded. So you could not go back and say, wasn't there a mother, that might match the decomposed corpse of that kid and so on. That was just impossible. Also, final thing, the education of the rural police, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, was of course very bad, because during the severe narcotics wars, policemen were just killed. So many normal people would not enter the police forces because it was dangerous. But that's just how it was.
Yeah, it's just a different, completely different world, isn't it? That
to what we call the Western world, or the rich world, but many countries suffer from such structural problems. So it's not as unusual as it may sound.
I understand. Can you describe for me the type of facility that Luis Garavito would have been held in? Would this be something like you would see in the Western world, or is this a real?
The first prison, apart from, I have to say, he was in prison when it was discovered that it was him. He's a trickster, very clever, street smart trickster. So when he went to prison, he gave a wrong name, etc. So he was under a different name in prison for a sexual assault of a kid. But nobody recognized that it was him, and nobody understood that this was a serial killing anyways. But once it was recognized, of course, he got a little bit beaten, by the people who questioned him. And then afterwards, he went to a prison that was very high violence prison, and people just couldn't leave him there because it was clear that he would be dead within 1 day, killed by the inmates. So they gave him the old there was a prison guard at the entrance. So Garavito was put in a little shack that was originally used for the prison guard at the entrance, and he had a little garden there. He didn't get any sharp tools, except of some articles like a pencil, string, paper, cardboard, and so on. But later he was moved to a different prison in the countryside, where his sister could also visit him. And that was just a normal, rural, small, friendly prison. So
was his sister?
So nothing.
Is it Esther you would be talking about? The sister?
I forgot her first name, but probably, yeah.
Okay.
I only know of that sister, one sister. So probably it's her.
Okay. It's such an odd thing to hear that he was, housed in a shack.
Well, yeah, no, but it was beautiful, compared to a normal prison cell. In that first prison, that it was not a shack like a garden shack that is dark and full of spiders or something like that. Not at all.
Oh no, that's what I mean. It's odd that for his protection he almost got a little bit of a special treatment because there was no other choice than to. I guess they had to protect him.
No, there was really no other choice, because at that point he was the first prisoner who only received 25 to 40 years of imprisonment, in contrast to the other ones, because that was before the law was changed. The other ones were in for actual life sentence, which means that they had nothing to lose. And when you think of the Jeffrey Dahmer case, everybody knows that once you kill a sexual offender, serial killer, especially if he's a pedophile, a sadist, then this is good for you in the prison hierarchy. So It was clear that he was going to be killed.
Yeah, that's. Well, I mean, Luis had a fear that someone was going to try and kill him from in prison anyway. That might not even be an inmate. I mean, I read in your article that when you were brought coffee, he himself switched your mugs around. Now, from your perspective, I mean, were you at any point thinking, well, okay, what if I drank this coffee and someone has indeed tried to poison him? Did that never cross your mind?
No, I'm totally relaxed in situations like that, because we deal with very, very problematic people, starting from just parents who dragged their decomposed kid out of the garden, water basin, and are in a very problematic relationship status now because they're the parents, and they don't know what to do. And instead of talking about, is this a crime or was it an accident, they're talking about their marital relationship and so on, over lots of organized crime, also cases that get covered up by the prosecution or by whomever. Sometimes I sit there with very friendly people from organized crime, suit and tie at the airport restaurant, and everybody is very friendly and exactly what's going on. And so the whole situation in Colombia was really friendly for me, because these are such good and friendly people in Colombia. This is one of the friendliest places on planet Earth. So I was like, okay, if I get prisoned inside of the cage where I'm sitting with a serial killer, then that's just fate. I mean, no problem.
Yeah.
No problem, really.
Well, thank God that didn't happen. I can't imagine how I would process something like that. But then again, this is why you're a professional and I'm a YouTuber, So I'll move on. The influence of alcohol in the crimes of Luis Garavito played a huge role, and I wondered if you think Luis would have committed the crimes if alcohol wasn't present.
You know what? You're the first person to ask the question, but I stumbled across that problem when I was working on another case. Jürgen Bartsch, he's not so much known in the international true crime community, but that was one of the cases that really, really shook post-war Germany.
Who was it?
Jürgen Bartsch.
Oh, yes.
Probably impossible.
I read about him in your article, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I just out of a remark from some letters that he wrote, I read that he was drinking alcohol, and then I asked somebody whom he knew, also a homosexual journalist. Jürgen Bartsch was also a male homosexual, and they understood each other pretty well. And I asked this guy and asked him, were you under the impression that Jürgen Bartsch was an alcoholic? Because he was caught when he was 19 and he already killed 4 kids or young people by torturing them to death, and the 5th one escaped. And everybody said, like, alcohol, yeah, I don't know, yeah, it's possible. And I'm like, gee, I mean, how do they not see that if Bartsch himself mentions that? And also, we know that people who have psychological problems very often use drugs and alcohol to get rid of whatever is going on in their heads. So I was like, okay, maybe people are so used to alcohol as a drug that it's totally normal for them. And they, even if it's I wouldn't say clear or obvious, but even if this is a contributing factor, they just don't account for it, because everybody at that point drank alcohol probably on a daily basis at home, the beer at night or a glass of wine at night, and thought it was perfectly normal. So I had that in mind. And that's why I asked the police in the Garavito case, and Garavito himself also, because we had a stain. These were the little caps that formerly were on beer bottles, and from a particular brand, Poker beer from Colombia. And so I asked him, and he was also like, yeah, of course, I was drunk all the time. So as a criminalist or a forensic biologist, which I am, and somebody who works with those cases for 30 years now, I would say it's a huge contributing factor. It's not the one that if you pull that one out will make the case disappear and the crime disappear, but it is definitely a contributing factor. And I would say whenever you see people using drugs, especially alcohol, then these people are unlucky, unhappy, unbalanced. Something is wrong with them. I mean, alcohol, now that we are speaking, it's February 2022. So most people think drinking alcohol all the time is pretty normal at parties and in the evening, at festivities, celebrations, and so on. But I don't think that anymore. Really, it is a very destructive drug. And we know that because a study from my colleague David Nutt did show that alcohol is one of the most dangerous drugs when you look at what they do to others, not only to yourself, but what they do to others. There's first heroin, then alcohol. And I know most people who will hear that now would think, oh, probably Binecki is like a Puritan or like some religious guy.
I don't think that. I tend to agree with you.
I'm not a teetotaler or anything, but
Yeah, me either.
it is.
100% tend to agree with you there, and the more I move on, I mean, I lived in Ireland for 16 years, where alcohol is a massive part of the culture, and I played in the bars. And once I started driving myself to gigs all around Ireland, I noticed that, hold on, is this what you're supposed to do every night? You know, and not that everyone does it every night, but there's just quite a lot more tolerance for it in that culture. And I started to notice that. I suppose what stood out to me with Garavito was I had a question in my mind, and my question to help me determine how much of the responsibility lie on intoxication. The question would be, well, was he drunk as he led them away to the crime scenes? Because I read that he left a lot of bottles and that he had drank at the crime scene. So I would wonder if he was sober as he was leading these boys away, then that would lead me to believe that they may have helped him complete the deed, but he was going for that anyway. That was just my own sort of understanding.
No, those killers in general, let's call them psychopathic killers, they would do it anyways, but I think they take more of a risk, like everybody who's drinking alcohol. So the more alcohol you drink, the more risk you take. And that's how, in some situations in which he probably would not have abducted the kids, or not abducted, but lured them away, he would not have done it. Since I would say technically he's an alcoholic, you can never say if he is drunk or not, because those people who are used to alcohol probably may drink a can or two of beer, which to a normal person during noontime would not be a very good thing. But I've been working at the French National Police for a very brief interval, and for them, for example, it was normal to drink a glass of wine during noontime meals. So, and they could continue to work. So I would say the alcohol is just a contributing factor, but it doesn't matter if he did it whilst he was killing everybody or whilst he was luring them away and abducting them. It's just one part of the whole mosaic of his personality, which made him more of a risk taker. That's all.
That's a great answer. I think that's a really good answer. Yeah, that helps me understand that particular facet a little better. So yeah, thank you for that. You mentioned in your article that was published in the UK that several factors, including his Garavito's traumatic childhood environment, blended together to create the beast inside Luis Garavito. As you stated, Garavito is an antisocial narcissist, and more specifically, a psychopath. But if his trauma happened during his childhood and it helped create the hell that he is, why is he considered a psychopath and not a sociopath?
Because in our discipline, we don't use the term sociopath. That is just a thing, because the definition of a sociopath is so unclear that we prefer to follow two guidelines or two standard research volumes. That's International Classification of Diseases and the DSM, which the one is more used in the United States and the other one is used in other parts of the world. And in there's always the latest research which defines what is an illness, what is it, they wouldn't call it like that, but what is a deviation? Or in former times, when we are talking about crimes like this, what would be a perversion? Of course, that term is not used anymore. Or what is just something that you do, but it doesn't harm anybody, and it's not a problem for you anyways. For example, consenting sadomasochistic practices. This is something that is considered to be normal. As long as everybody consents and they're adults and grown-ups, then it's not a problem anymore. Or homosexuality, which was considered formerly to be deviant, and now everybody says, like, what are you talking about, man? So it's not even in the manuals anymore. So that's why we don't use the term sociopath. But I mean, you are right. You can never distinguish between a traumatic influence and what the outcome, because this, we know that for sure genetically and on the, let's say, the plain brain level, changes your brain. So any trauma, even inside of the womb of your mother, even for an unborn kid, this is proven scientifically, will change your DNA, the methylation pattern on your DNA, especially stress will cause that. So let's say you have a mother or a father or both who have a lot of stress due to psychological problems, due to work stress, due to whatever, trauma influence, even a car accident. But at the same time, you have the genetic influence, of course, that sometimes is behind psychological and psychiatric disorders. And all that, when it comes to his childhood, he could not learn anything, even if he wanted to learn things. His father told him that learning, that's something that we don't need here. We are working on the field and we are living the farm life. We don't need education of any type. That alone must be very traumatic for an intelligent kid. I mean, it may sound mild, but if you're in a totally kind of gated environment, you cannot escape from a totally poor environment. You cannot buy a ticket and just go to the big town because you don't have the clothing. You don't know how to speak. You don't know whom to talk to. You have no money, no nothing. So he had to work with potatoes on the field. At the same time, rape was completely normal and sexual abuse in the community in which he grew up. I heard that many, many times because one of the problems is in Colombia, you can legally have sex at a younger age. That's one of the problems. But the next problem is that the whole idea that this may cause severe disturbances in the behavior and in the brain and DNA patterns and everything of a kid, that was just unknown. I mean, it was even unknown in the industrialized countries for a very long time. And we had very long discussions of why you should, under no circumstance, touch the kids, even if they behave sexually. I mean, you can have kids that behave sexually, but you still don't touch them because you are the adult responsible person. Absolutely. Who knows that there will be nothing good coming out of it. And so I mean, he really had a very bad start, and that made it all worse. So probably he was psychopathic, and then referring to your phrase, the sociopath. So that means the nature and nurture mixed perfectly, in the bad sense, perfectly, to make him the person, la bestia, the monster that he became.
My video is actually titled "He is Hell," because I can't think of a better way to describe everything, from what's inside him, his own trauma, to him passing it down. That's great insight. I really appreciate that.
And also, another hellish thing, since that's your title, is that he's such a friendly person. So I mean, it's like with Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer would not have probably been a lucky person who lived a full, beautiful life, as some people may consider a life to be worthy living. But many of these serial killers, including Garavito, may never have become criminal in that sense, or hellish in that sense, as you would understand it, because we know that there are factors that also even psychopathic people can benefit from, and then they choose jobs in which they, for example, in a bank or performing surgery under very problematic circumstances, or in warfare as generals, soldiers, and so on. So they find their place. They are still antisocial and they are still psychopathic, but they do not commit crimes as we understand crimes. And I think Dahmer, Garavito, Barch, and many, many others, they if they would have had better influences in their early life, then that would have protected them and society.
So being a psychopath, it doesn't inherently make you evil. I think that's a pretty safe assumption to make. But
it depends on your definition of evil.
but there is that tendency to manipulate and deceive, given the opportunity, if you possess psychopathic traits, or if you're indeed psychopathic. Would that be a safe assumption?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and they, one thing that is probably interesting for people who do not work with, at least not with criminal psychopathic persons, they usually, most people think they lie whenever they open their mouth, so to speak. But that is absolutely not true. If you approach a criminal psychopath who is interested in the conversation, like Garavito was in talking with me, then they can be totally honest, 100% honest and open. I mean, of course.
Well, yeah, of course, because they without something like remorse, what have you got to lose if it's not protecting you to lie? Yeah, great. Yeah, that makes sense. I never thought of that. Wow.
And so if you plug out morality and ethics and social standards, then there are just two people sitting there who are experts. So he's the only living expert for his crimes because he was the only one who was there. And I, in that case, was the only one who was willing to accept him as a human being, and not in a friendly, soft way, but just he's a human being, professional, and but also personally. I mean, he's in prison now. The crimes that he committed them. Nothing will change that. So the only thing that we can do is try to find out how to prevent further crimes. And the only one who can help us is, in that case, him. And if he cooperates, he's going to help us in prevention. And if he's not cooperating, then nothing happens. So to me, he is actually kind of a colleague or co-worker. You know, it sounds awkward and weird to say that, but we are actually on the same working level there. So it's nothing that I have to, because many of my United States colleagues, they told me, you know, you can lie to him, you can treat him like, and then swear words and so on. And I was like, no. I'm not interested in that. Either he helps us and then he is helpful in that moment. Yeah. That doesn't make his crimes go away, but he's still a helpful person in that moment. And if I start to deceive him and to lie to him and manipulate him, then how am I better? So I didn't do that.
Well, you certainly wouldn't be fulfilling your objective. And you're right. At that point, he is your textbook with that specific case, at least. And without that textbook, you may not like the author of that textbook, and I certainly don't. But I'm sure you don't either. But that's not going to get you anywhere in that position. So I totally understand the professionalism of the work that you do, and that totally makes sense to me. You discussed fantasies with Garavito. What roles do fantasies play in Garavito's MO, and how do fantasies of a psychopathic killer differ from the fantasies of someone who, you know, we might consider, I guess, neurotypical?
To be honest, no difference. The problem is that let's talk about only core sexual fantasies to make it easy. So everybody has a core sexual fantasy. It doesn't matter if you talk about that or not, but when you think about queer people, let's just talk. Let's say male homosexuals and lesbians to make it easy for the moment. I think since it is the year 2022, and since many of the listeners and viewers of your program may probably over the age of 30, or some of them, probably when you look around, you will still see lesbian and male homosexual people, gay people, who are in a heterosexual relationship just for job reasons or for social reasons or for cultural reasons. And you know, what is their fantasy if they perform sexual, you know, whatever they do sexually with their partner, with their married partner? You don't know what's in their heads. Well, we do know what's in their heads, because there's research going on for that from starting with Sharon Haidt and Kinsey and many other colleagues for tens of years now. And we know that the core sexual fantasy is not going to go away. It could be something really which sounds funny, especially fetishistic things like, you know, okay, during sex, I want to rub a balloon or have rubber boots on my feet or something like that. Sure. But it's not funny for those people, because for them, if they learn very early on that if they mention that to a possible partner, and then the partner would say, okay, I really like you as a friend, but no, rubber boots during sex. I'm sorry, that just turns me off. It's not against you, but it turns me off. And now it's just a continuum, and at the very end of the continuum, you have the non-consensual, sadistic, psychopathic serial killer. But the core sexual fantasy is the driver. It's the driver for the decisions in your life. The decisions could be very kind of massaged into your local society, so that you, like I said, decide to marry a heterosexual partner, though you're homosexual, or there are millions of things, but it is one of the major drivers in everybody's life. And you don't have to like that, and you don't have to accept that, but that's the problem with the monsters, with the serial killer monsters. They are so similar to most of what we do, and sometimes they're even more honest compared to what neurotypical people, like you were calling them, or allegedly normal people do. That, in my opinion, that is not the main factor. So the sexual fantasies are just defining, as you were calling it, the MO, the modus operandi, but that's it. So if they had a different sexual core fantasy, then they would commit the crime in a different way, but it would still be a crime that is non-consensual.
But isn't some of the reasons people like Luis Garavito or even say Richard Huckle, the pedophile from the UK, isn't the reason some of these guys keep journals to not only relive the fantasy, but maybe even deeper than that, they didn't quite get to execute the fantasy the way they wanted, so it's almost like they're retrying a level in a game over and over and over until they get it right. Would that be?
That's true, but I think in many cases the diaries or the little whatever they take, like trinkets, it could be a bra or a ring,
trophies,
or a photograph, a trophy or something. Whatever they take, it's also a symbol for them. They don't know that, but it is a symbol that they cannot deeply connect to other people. So they take something that it's material. Like when you have a super beautiful moment at the beach, with a bottle of your favorite lemonade and your partner, and the sun is going down and there's the water and whatever, the stars and the sunset, then you can keep that, as people say, in your heart. But they can't. They keep it in their brain, or they take something that is literally made out of a material. It's like a souvenir when you go to the beach, and then sometimes you bring a mussel home, and then 10 years later somebody says, "Hey Dad, can we throw the stupid mussels out?" And then you're like, yeah, no problem. They were beautiful for 10 years, but it's okay. I still remember the holiday in my heart. It's not about the mussels that I brought, the shells, but it's about the memory. And they do have the memory, and they can relive that out of their memory, but at the same time they want that souvenir. And the main reason might be that they cannot do it often enough. It's not so much that they do not reach their sexual fantasy. I think that especially in Garavito's case, since he did it many times, like over 300 times, he did reach a sexual fantasy, like cutting off the head during sexual intercourse, cutting off the penis, putting it into the head, it's the severed head, and so on. So that worked probably very well. And even other offenders like Jürgen Bartsch, they were saying, we felt very well, and we feel full and happy and relaxed at that moment. Yeah. So I think that they had, out of their perspective, they had their fantasy fulfilled. But it happens not often enough. Let's say you have a perfect relationship, poly or mono or whatever type of relationship you want to have, but at least you have the option to do it, let's say, as often as you want. So let's say 3 times a week. At least you can discuss that. You could talk to your partner and say, are you interested? And then if you are on the same brain wavelength, then you could say, yeah, let's do it. And then it's not always perfect, but you can do it often, just from the number of times you can do it in a good situation, in a nice situation. But for them, it's very complicated, because they always have to take care that they are not getting caught, that they are not getting disturbed, that probably the scheme is not discovered, especially with the kids. I mean, since Garavito kept several kids, he also had to take care that not one of the kids runs away whilst he's engaging doing horrific things to the other kids. Some other offenders really have the fantasy to have the person completely under their control. So they bind the person cannot move. Okay, nothing can go wrong. But many of those offenders don't have the fantasy to completely bind the person, but in contrast, they want them to run around a little. Like there was a case that was called Butcher Baker. He would even release the victims and then hunt them with a rifle. So it was fun for him to release them and let them run around of course, in a remote spot where they would have frozen sooner or later. But
Sure.
anyways, and
Garavito did something similar as well, didn't he? Where he would tie them up to an extent that they weren't completely confined. They could move, but they couldn't get away. There was no, and he would wear them out by walking them considerably long distances. Or
but it's difficult to know, because sometimes he also kept other kids watching whilst he tortured one of the kids to death. So in those cases, you never know if he knew, since he's a pedophile, he knows a little bit about how kids react, or a lot how kids react. So maybe he was just like, okay, I don't have to bind those kids so severely and tightly, because they're not going to run away whilst they see what I'm doing right here. So they're going to be afraid or something like that. So we don't fully know why he chose which type of bindings. That's unknown in his case.
Give me 2 seconds. I just want to press this record button again. Okay. Also, and this question just came to me. It seems to me that especially guys like Bondi, Lopez, Garavito, it seems like there was some kind of addiction at work. So even maybe even a tolerance, as you saw perhaps that was just them perfecting their lived out fantasy. But it seemed there was a tolerance, and they would kind of go higher and higher, or at least increase the frequencies of these. And I wonder if after they're captured, do they suffer any kind of suffer? Kind of a poor word, but you know what I mean. Would they experience any withdrawal symptoms from this addiction?
First, the term addiction is difficult, because let's say you have the capability to have a strong emotional bond to somebody. That is not an addiction, and that's what they are looking for. They are looking for a strong emotional bond, but they cannot have it because they are psychopathic. So it's not really an addiction. It's more like the search that from these, the people who are on dating sites and dating a lot and having a lot of sex. And after 20 years, they're like, okay, I had 500 sexual partners, but I would have preferred one partner and a strong, emotional, deep relationship. And this is what those people are after at the very end, but they don't know it.
Wow.
So I would just call it the search for a stable, good, deep relationship, which they cannot have. And do they have withdrawal? Totally. Fritz Hamann, who was an offender in Germany, was a very good example for that. The police put one of the skulls, like a boiled skull, so there was no more flesh on it and so on, in his prison cell, and put a little candle in the skull to terrify him. So because he was like very soft and very kind of friendly, and the police was like, what the hell is wrong with that guy? He should talk clearly and straightly and not behave so softly and friendly with us. And so they thought it was a good idea to traumatize him a little bit and put a skull of one of the kids that he killed in the corner of his prison cell, so he could not reach it. And so the candle would flicker at night, and then it would he would have shadows out of the actual head. And what happened was that one day he went to the psychiatrist who conducted the interviews for the police and told him, you know what? I have the skull of one of the kids in my prison cell. And everybody was like, now he's cracking. Now he's breaking down. And he was like, and now I have a question for you. I have headaches. Could you bring me a few kids in my prison cell? Because I think that will relieve me from my headaches. And everybody was like, oh, fuck, this didn't go well. So the contrary thing happened. He remembered the killings of the kids, and he was like, "Oh, that that was actually nice. It's nice of the police to to put one of the skulls of the kids with a flickering candle inside of a prison cell." And there you can see kind of a withdrawal. But
like a fix. He got a fix almost. Yeah.
Yeah, on the one hand, but at the same time, let's say your personal significant other partner dies, then you also need the fix, and you are sad, and you want a new relationship. So I think they're not that different from us when it comes to the search for a deep emotional relationship. But the difference is that many people find a way to find such relationship, or they just stay alone. That's also a thing that people tend to forget. There are a lot of lonely people on this planet, and they just decided, like, after 20 years of searching for a soulmate, okay, it's not going to happen. I'm going to buy 2 cats, and I'm not searching. I stop the search. So that's why I wouldn't call it an addiction in a bad way, because then everybody is addicted to love, so to speak.
Sure, yeah. So they actually are, in a sense, searching for what we're searching for. Their relation to that just can never be like ours, and it's because I remember in your article, Jürgen, is that how you say the guy's name, Jürgen?
Yes.
He even stated he felt love, like what he was doing was almost like, for him, this was almost affection.
Yes, and I believe him, because once you get such offenders to talk about the moment when they fulfill their core sexual fantasy, they describe exactly what neurotypical people experience when they have a very beautiful romantic moment. They don't know that. They don't know what they're describing. But especially 2 factors I personally found quite interesting. The borders to the rest of the world disappear. You feel one with the universe or one with the other person. You feel the sense of being united with nature, with other people, with the universe. With you can embrace everything, and you feel relieved for a moment. All the pressure and the pain and the sorrow is going away, and that is what you experience in a very deep love relationship. You feel safe and secure in that moment. So I'm personally pretty convinced that it is love, but as you were saying during the introduction, of course, a kind of love that is hellish.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Yeah. It's not relative to us in the sense of that, but in terms of the feeling, it's probably the closest thing that they can get to that bond for horrible, hellish reasons. Yeah. Wow. Great insight. Definitely. You mentioned in your interview as well that you attempted to discuss some serial killers with Luis Garavito, but I guess he wasn't entirely interested in them when he found out they had a lower number of victims than him. Do you think that Luis Garavito's body count was like some kind of personal high score or some kind of competition between him and other serial killers?
No, I think he just he could do it because he slipped. Okay, the main reason technically was he was traveling a lot. He was traveling back and forth, and also there were never any DNA tests done. The juridical system, the law system, everything that could have led to finding out that this was a serial killer case at all just didn't work. So I think most of the serial killers would go for such a score because, again, if you imagine how often a normal person is trying to engage in something romantic or sexual, that could even be on a daily basis. I mean, if you have a very good, stable relationship, then probably, one day you bring flowers home, the next day somebody is cooking something for the other person, the next day you do something with whatever, friends or the kids, or you alone and sit in the garden and watch the birds. So probably allegedly normal people do that tens and thousands of times just to achieve the good feeling that you have when you feel bonded to life. So I think it's not a competition or anything that the serial killers do. It's just if they get the chance, then they go for the score that everybody else also goes for. But in normal cases, it's something beautiful and not something dark, like in the serial killer cases.
Well, obviously for themselves. I mean, to us, it really is hell, But yeah, I think I understand what you're saying there. We know Garavito was probably telling the truth about the abuse he suffered as a child. If I'm correct, you actually confirmed some of his accounts with his own siblings. I'm guessing that was his sister Esther. Can you tell me more about your conversation with her? Because I know you said you'd been in touch personally. And one of the biggest things I found while researching this case was that people were sort of same as Pedro Alonso. They weren't entirely sure he was these guys were telling the truth here. And I always thought, well, in the Garavito case, if you knew it was happening to his siblings, then that would be a good indication that he actually did suffer the trauma he said. Not to mention what the heinousness of his crimes. But when you spoke to his sibling, she obviously confirmed the abuse happened at the hands of Manuel and Rosa, I think was the mom's name.
It was something that we didn't dig too much into, because we were more like sitting in front of the prison, having lemonades, and the sun was shining. Sure. And burning my feet. So I got a sunburn on my feet because I'm a stupid white guy who didn't cover his feet. And it was more like a peaceful conversation, and she confirmed a lot, especially that Garavito, like Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, did not have access to education and things like that. So I was just talking a little bit here and a little bit there, but I did not go too much into the sexual abuse, because of course it could be made up. You never know, but I had no indication for that. And since I know that sexual abuse and violence in all types of relationships is so widely distributed, even in highly industrialized countries, to me that is not even a big thing, because I know it happens all the time everywhere, and it's not the major contributing factor to serial killing. So therefore, for me, it's just like, okay, yeah, I personally believe it, but it's not one of our major focuses in such cases.
Sure. Yeah, I can understand that. I guess just in this specific case, he seemed to do what the neighbor did to him with the candles and the razors and the rope. It seemed to be what he distributed on to others, which actually brings me to my next question. Yeah. As a victim of child sex abuse myself, I can't understand why someone would hand down the same horrible trauma and pain that was inflicted upon them. Garavito went as far as to commit those same torture methods as I just mentioned, but it feels like my trauma that I experienced heightened my empathy and sympathy towards the innocents, while it erased Garavito's. But as you say, maybe he just never possessed it in the first place. But why would he? Yeah. Why would he repeat the trauma that was done to him by the neighbor? Why would that then become his branding method, I guess?
To be honest, that's my personal opinion. It's because that's what they learned first. You see that a lot in sexual abuse cases, that type of sexual conduct that happens, whatever happens initially, may sometimes become a core sexual behavior, because it's like, some people know that from cute animals. When you usually, a wild animal will never be friends to human being, but when you rescue the little whatever bird, then it will have a bond to you and visit you sometimes. And even if it's normally a wild animal, then it will start to not fear humans again. So it just learned that humans can be friendly. And I think when it comes to sexual dealings, the ones that you learn first are the ones that are deeply engraved in your brain. And then, depending on your personality, you would decide that you just don't want to hand that down to other people if it was something that is unpleasant and unfriendly. But at the same time, in very many cases, especially in child abuse, that's the only type of, I wouldn't call it affection, but that's the only type of interest that or being in the field of view of others that these kids have. So either they do something sexual, or they are just not there. They're just not present. They are not of interest.
Attention. It's the only form of attention, I suppose. Then it could, for a kid, it could translate into affection.
Yeah, totally. And also, they just learn that type of behavior very early on, and later on, they don't even realize that they relive this again in a situation that may cause trauma to themselves. I mean, it's obvious that if you do something violent to another person that was done to you, that now you're getting it out of your system probably. But you and I, we would know, okay, probably you get it out of your system, but your brain is still engaged with the same problem. So you are reliving the problem all over and over again. And that is certainly not a good thing to do. So you better stop doing that and find a better way of living. But again, if it is a core sexual fantasy that develops, there's nothing that you can do against that. I mean, there were so many programs that tried to reprogram the core sexual fantasies of people, and it never ever worked. Never. So maybe it's just a very simple thing of they learned it very early on, they got the attention, they got the affection, they got the interest of the rest of the world, they got a feeling of connection, and then nobody tells them that they're re-traumatizing themselves, not talking about everybody else whom they traumatize, obviously, too. So I think that's it. They just learned it too early, and wrong time, wrong place, wrong behavior.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I never thought of it like that, reprogramming a sexual fantasy. Yeah, that reminds me of a case, the Child of Rage documentary, with the little girl who experienced the sexual trauma, and they were interviewing her. I think she was 5 in the video. But one of the things they had to do to get her to, because she was inflicting it then on her brother after she was adopted, and one of the things they had to do is they had to put her literally in a place where she had to ask permission to do everything. This was the treatment, basically. She couldn't go to the bathroom without permission. She couldn't get a glass of water without permission. She couldn't stand up without permission. Everything had to be almost reprogrammed from the ground up. Now, from what I've read, she turned out pretty well, ended up going on to help people. But I wonder if those devious core sexual fantasies that were, traumatically imprinted into her, I wonder if they did in fact follow her through adulthood.
Exactly. That's the big question, and most people won't talk about it. That's why I mentioned the studies of Haidt and Kinsey and Masters and Johnson and so on before. It is known for a very long time that most people hide away their core sexual fantasy from their long-term partners. They just don't talk about it because they experience that even things that would be considered harmless, if you just talked openly about them, may have caused such a stress before that people just learned that it's better not to talk about it. And I mean, when you think about it, that many people report that they are allegedly not interested in sexual, whatever doings over time. I'm always asking myself, is that really just because they get older or something like that, whatever people think happens? Or is it just because they would never stick to their core sexual fantasies? Because those people I know today, that's not much of a problem in big cities anymore when you belong to queer communities, etc., etc.
Sure.
But those people usually either go into the direction of just have a stable partnership. Sex is not that important anymore. But I also know people who say, okay, I can have a stable relationship or many relationships at the same time, but sex is very important for me. And they don't lose interest at the very same rate that many other people lose interest in sex. So maybe, like you were saying, maybe it did follow her and she just learned that she cannot talk about it anymore because it's stressful for other people, stressful for her, and not doing any good to anybody. And you know that from people who are lying, for example, for tax evasion. I mean, there are so many people out there who are just not paying their taxes or tricking the tax authorities and so on. And most of them don't talk about it as long as they think this may cause, a bad atmosphere. As soon as you bring them into an environment where everybody else is doing it too, then they probably, think, okay, I'm doing something.
Oh.
So I think the sexual thing may have followed the kid once she got adult. It is possible.
Wow. unfortunate in obviously cases like that. Yeah. That's very interesting. These are my final two questions, and I'll be brief because I think you've been more than helpful. You've given me much more time than I anticipated. There's a good chance that they'll let Luis Garavito out of prison, just like they did Pedro Lopez. How do you feel about this possibility?
It's not good, because I talked to the police about that. There are very many problems attached to that. I won't say more, but I mean, personally, it's. I mean, he tricked the system juridically, so that's not his problem. The laws were there. The change of the laws happened exactly when it was discovered that he was the serial killer who was already in prison. So that's not his bad, but he is a trickster. Let's leave it like that. He is a born trickster. And I mean, people, since the Marvel Cinematic Universe makes Loki the trickster god, also a negative and positive person at the same time. But Garavito is too troubled. I think it's also not good for him, but especially not good for society. I'm not saying that he's going to commit crimes immediately again, because probably he understands that now the forensic techniques are just better, and he may be discovered much more easily than before, or something like that, something very rational. But I don't think that he's going to relearn what he would have had to relearn during the time. I think in prison, he just learned to continue to trickster his way through the system. And yeah, okay, I'll stop here.
Sure. Yeah, and I understand that too. I guess I look at it with the Pedro Alonso case, and I think, well, he got out, and he's kind of immediately being linked to another possible case. But yeah, I feel that you don't want to continue on that, so we won't. And the last thing that I have, Dr. Benecki, is there anything you can tell me about your time with Luis Garavito that you haven't told anyone else, or anything you discovered that isn't popularly known about him that you think people should know?
No, I don't know, but I would like to stress, after such a long time, and also talking to many offenders, to many families, to many victims who survived, to many communities, subculture communities, because I work a lot with subculture communities too. If a person is genuinely friendly, then there is a seed of hope that this person may cooperate, if let's say it's an offender, may cooperate in a way that is helpful for society. And I really dislike the idea that you put yourself over the offenders, try to use and abuse them for whatever purpose, and just think that then you are the good guy. I think the only way to deal with these people, like Garavito, for example, is that he is friendly, he is looking for types of connections, he wants to be somebody, he wants to be seen, like many people. He wants to he's the little kid that never got attention, or if it got attention, then it was abused sexually and also in many other ways. So that's not going to go away. So maybe since you cannot change that the crimes happened, give them, for once in their lives, a little bit of honest attention and make something good out of it, so that the next case doesn't happen. I know I mentioned that before, but that's the only thing that is probably never stressed enough when it comes to true crime and serial killers and exciting criminal cases and so on. These are real people of whom we can learn a lot. they are valuable. If people cannot deal with that, then that's not a problem. I can understand that many people have feelings of revenge and hate and violence against such offenders. I understand. But then, maybe choose a different topic and different path in your life and don't deal with that. Because if it's only causing you trouble and pain and feelings of hate and so on, then walk away from that, leave it as it be, and let somebody else work with such cases.
I understand. I definitely understand. And while we may not completely agree on everything, I really respect your time and your deeply professional, educated, and experienced opinion on this stuff. It's been absolute honor to learn from you today. This is supposed to be a conversation, but I think I've learned a lot from this conversation myself. So maybe you did a free lecture for me. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. But we don't have to agree on anything, because this is such a dark place with so much prejudice against and not enough research, that it would be weird if we would agree on everything. So it's a good thing that we probably have different opinions on some of the things, because then that can be researched, and out of the different opinions, the truth in the scientific sense comes out. So I'm I'm also glad that you were interested.
Very interested. It's been very eye-opening. I mean, this conversation's not just going to help me with this case, but it helps me observe future cases too. Because as you say, I agree to an extent that I shouldn't let my contempt for the evil get in the way of the research and the learning. While I'll always, and I think it's probably because of what I went through in the past, and my mother, and just it's kind of a lot in my family. So I harbor a little bit of anger towards these guys, but I will do my best not to let that get in the way of what I learn in my research, and maybe you've kind of given me a light to that today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure. It really is. Okay. I'll let you get back to your trip in New York, and thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this time. I really appreciate that. Okay, cool. Marky Mark.
Good night.
See you later. Thank you.
Dr. Mark Benecki is an experienced professional expert, and he makes a fair point. Why wouldn't he? This is what he does. What would we learn from this horrible situation if Mark had lost his cool and berated or even taken a swing at Garavito post-crimes? How many lost, dead children would still be out there? And how much further would we be in terms of understanding and preventing monsters like Luis Garavito from existing, or at least operating? I learned something while listening to Mark, and I don't say that lightly. Without people like him, we'd be no further feet forward. And as hard as it is to bear in mind, just like famines and the Holocaust, it's part of history. Dark history for sure, but understanding why it happened directly affects the future in ways we may never see. I like Mark. He isn't advocating for Luis Garavito to be free or making excuses for what he did. He's simply trying to make lemonade out of acid. Because of what Dr. Mark Benecki does, and because of the cool he can maintain in front of some of mankind's worst monsters, the next Luis Garavito or Pedro Lopez or, hell, even Adolf Hitler may never be. So I commend him. It's a tough and brave job. But Dr. Benecki, I know you won't like this, but with all due respect, on behalf of myself and all the other child victims of the world, when you're done with the beast, and there's nothing left to learn, I'd rather you put it to sleep. We've seen where situations like this can lead. Pedro Lopez got out, and he's been linked to the murder of another little girl. They still don't know where he is. Look at Vince Lee from the Greyhound bus beheading. Doctors got involved with their psycho theories, and that guy's out too. He literally cut someone's head off on a bus in front of everyone and proceeded to eat that man. Rest in peace, Tim McLean. So I'm more than willing to learn, but I'll never understand how they can let sadistic beasts like this out of the cage. And if you've got any connections over there, or there's anything you can do to stop his release, please do it. Because the only child killer that deserves to be released from prison is a dead one, because they'll stink the place up. I'm Mr. Black, and this is the disturbing truth.